Hello, welcome back. We have our final lecture on the Progressive Era, the Reform Era, the Gilded Age, however you want to call it. Today we are going to be wrapping up our look at that era that coincided with the Industrial Revolution, coming towards the later end of it, where the American people attempted to try and fix some of the problems that industrialization had caused. So our final look here, we are going to be taking a look at the politics of the era. We're going to see how they finally did away with the political machine, some of those progressive politicians, see even some presidents that were labeled as progressive. We'll also take a look at what's happening in the workforce, where they're demanding better working conditions, better situations, wages for labor. We're going to see the rise of labor unions and how we have even the birth of the modern work week, 8-hour work week, unless you're a teacher. But anyways, jokes aside, let's go ahead and roll into it. Again, we're going to start off here by talking about industry, what's happening with the workforce. So we've mentioned unions at multiple times. I don't know that we've actually defined what that really means, but a union is when workers join together to demand fair wages and working conditions. Unions at this time are really starting to gain steam, and frankly, I would say probably peak in the 1950s, 1960s as very powerful organizations. Today, they are still very popular in many different industries, and some that may not be considered, your blue-collar workers as well. There are unions in a lot of different types of work situations. Teachers' unions are, of course, very popular. So a union, comes together and basically says, we have to be treated equally, and it puts some pressure on the owners of these businesses because if you mistreat a few, the union will join together to make sure that those wrongs are righted. So when somebody would be fired because they for some ridiculous reason, the union could say, this was not something that should have happened, and the union can stand up against that. Or, the wages have decreased unfairly when profits were rising, the union may stand up and more powerful together in numbers. Let's take a look at some uses, some actual labor unions, early labor unions, and some of the events that they were a part of in this early period. 1869, we have one of the first major labor unions called the Knights of Labor. Some of the things that they were working for, and you'll see that we've arrived at some of these, they wanted an 8-hour workday. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Equal pay for women, which women still, on average, have not yet gotten, even here in 2020. The abolition of child labor, okay, another thing that they're going to be pushing for. 1869, that's a long, long time ago. We're talking 5 years after the Civil War. So we're starting to see the beginnings of industry, some of those demands start to emerge in this even early period of the Industrial Revolution. One tactic that the Knights of Labor used was what was called arbitration. Instead of just this conflict between the workers and the bosses, what they would often do is have a third party, maybe even a judge. I always think of like baseball arbitration, right? Where they have a third party that doesn't necessarily represent the interests of the workers or of the bosses, but a third party that says, reach an agreement, what is fair for both parties involved. And that was a tactic that they used to try and get fair wages and things like that. One of the more popular ones that would come later on is the American Federation of Labor. And what made this one unique was that it actually joined different unions together into a single union. So, if the electrical workers ended up going on strike for some reason, that might mean that the steel workers would also follow suit. So it gave even more power to workers to band together to make sure that their voices were heard and they were protected. The leader of the AFL early on, at least one of the most powerful, was a man named Samuel Gompers, and he would become kind of the face of the AFL, very powerful figure later on. They would use another term that you need to know, collective bargaining, group negotiations. I mentioned teachers' unions earlier. That is something that teachers' unions have utilized, so each individual teacher doesn't have to go in and negotiate their own contract. The teachers' unions will sometimes negotiate collectively. They will bargain collectively to where they have kind of a fair salary for everyone instead of each person having to go in and basically fend for themselves. And so anyways, the AFL became another powerful union that emerged during this period. Now, not every union, was, just pushing for, normal things like well, again, not normal at the time, but what would be normal now, 8-hour work days and things like that. Some of them were even more radical and were pushing, for extreme changes. And the most radical of all labor unions emerged early on over in Europe. It's called the Industrial Workers of the World. This was a fairly radical labor union that was nicknamed the Wobblies. And so anyways, the IWW represented, the workers that, frankly, were getting angry that, negotiation was almost past for them. The IWW, even threatened violence at times if demands were not met. So, labor unions today, I think, now that we're looking back at this 100-year history of labor unions, they have taken on different forms over the years, some more radical as we see here, and others more conservative. The basic goal of a union is to protect its workers. Some have taken that to extremes, and because of that, labor unions are often very disputed. Some are extremely, proud today, but there's still some mistrust. Especially with what will happen, like I said, in the 1950s and 60s, where they really get tied to political leaders, and frankly, even it becomes a little bit more corrupt with the mafia. But that should not be the stereotype of labor unions. Many of them do a very good job of protecting workers, at least basic rights. The man pictured in the bottom right is Eugene V. Debs, and he would be a socialist candidate for president. We mentioned socialism in one of our previous lectures as something that many workers were actually suggesting may be a replacement for capitalism one day. People were starting to experiment with this. In fact, in a very short time at this period in history, we're going to start seeing some revolutions, some political revolutions in the world. And frankly, they very well may have happened here if the government had not stepped in and at least guaranteed some of these basic rights for workers. But Eugene V. Debs would become the main socialist candidate. In fact, he would run for president, I believe, 5 different times. Of course, never winning, and most third-party candidates don't really have that good of a shot. But, in 1912, where you really have kind of the height of the progressive era, he'd receive almost 1 million votes. So, socialism is going to be a very controversial topic, moving forward in our history. And frankly, that just becomes even more muddied as we get to the Cold War after World War II. Especially after the Soviet Union is born, we have communism kind of spreading. Socialism really becomes a bad word for many people, and looked upon much differently post World War II than it is pre World War II. But there were a lot of concerns, that this would lead to revolution and things like that. So definitely one of the more radical stances, both in terms of economics and politics. But I think was more powerful than we kind of give it credit at this time. All right, moving on. Let's take a look at some of the things unions did, some of the major protests. And of course, the ultimate power that unions have are to go on strike, to protest against wages or conditions. 1877, we have what's known as the Great Strike. You might have played Monopoly before and landed on B&O Railroad. That is actually named after a real railroad company called Baltimore and Ohio. And workers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company went on strike in 1877. And this turned violent, as many of these strikes did at the time. They had taken a wage cut, and they were not too happy about that, especially as the railroads are raking in literally millions of dollars for their owners. And so this one actually turned violent, and they did not just riot, but they began to actually vandalize and destroy a railroad line. 50,000 miles of railroad track had been stopped. What's interesting about the Great Strike of 1877 is the President of the United States, the man who actually ended Reconstruction, President Rutherford B. Hayes, ordered the strike to end. That doesn't seem to happen too often. It will actually happen again in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and air traffic controllers. But President Hayes here orders the strike to end, saying that these workers were impeding interstate commerce, and eventually it would come to an end. But that didn't mean that the issues were settled. And in fact, railroad companies, of course, being the biggest industry at that time, they were often kind of at the forefront of workers' rights and this clash that would happen. The Pullman strike was another major protest that took place after the company laid off a lot of employees and lowered their wages. Now, some of them were later rehired for either the same pay or even less, and this led to a lot of anger and resentment. Again, as these companies are raking in a lot of profits, they're cutting people's pay, and as you can see in that bottom picture, there was vandalism, rioting. Sometimes I think we watch the news and we think, oh man, things have never been this bad before. We've actually seen a lot of this violence and things before. I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that riots are the language of the unheard. Something to that effect. And, in this case, it was labor unions, it was laborers that were not being heard and did not feel they were getting a fair shake, and many of them took to the streets. Doesn't excuse the violence, but again, helps explain the violence, which is our goal in history. 1886, you have the Haymarket Riot. This was a nationwide strike, but in Chicago in particular, this became a deadly affair. Police moved in to stop the protest from happening. It had been peaceful up to this point. There had been speakers. There was a stage that had been built. There were speakers that were coming up to speak. The police tried to shut down this protest. No one exactly knows really what happened, but we do know at one point a bomb, basically a homemade bomb, kind of a pipe bomb of sorts, was thrown towards the police. Police opened fire on protesters. 4 protesters would end up dying from the bomb and from gunfire. And as you can imagine, the police did crack down. They ultimately arrested people that they claimed were responsible for it. History has not proven that to be correct, though. That the people that were arrested, as you can probably imagine, many of them immigrants, and a lot of historians have pointed to the fact that perhaps this was a little bit of scapegoating, in a massive crowd of thousands of people. You can see the numbers there. 3,000 people, were actually present at this protest. To actually identify those that threw the bombs, that were inciting this, it was probably very difficult to tell. But 7 German immigrants were arrested, 8 people total, and half of those were actually executed for their role in the Haymarket Riot. Once again, with very little evidence suggesting that they did, had anything to do with the actual bombing itself. The Homestead Strike. This took place at one of Carnegie's steel companies. We mentioned Carnegie being one of the so-called captains of industry, or robber barons, early on. His steelworkers went on strike, and what made matters worse was, as they're striking outside, Carnegie's company actually hired replacement workers who were, of course, arriving every day, taking that lower wage. And, it's hard to blame those guys. They needed to eat, and so they were happy to get to work. But, of course, for the protesters, they're looking at these individuals, which is kind of a nasty term, but they called these individuals who took their replacement jobs, they called them scabs. So they're watching these scabs walk into work, taking their jobs every day, and really undermining the whole purpose of the protests. If you're protesting for higher wages, but yet the company can still hire new people to work that job at those wages, it really takes all the power from your protest. So, it was becoming very tense. It was even becoming violent, fights breaking out. Carnegie hired a private detective agency called the Pinkerton Detective Agency to basically try to infiltrate and to basically find out, what the plans were for this protest. When those detectives arrived, it became very obvious who they were, and the striking workers believed that they were being attacked. And so there was gunfire that was exchanged. 9 detectives and workers would end up dead at the end of this strike. Another deadly labor protest that got out of hand. This was a chaotic time, and we kind of forget about this, but there was a lot of anger, and Again, the things that these people are fighting for, livable wages, safe working conditions. They are not asking for, $1,000 an hour. These people are asking for $1 a day. They're asking for, very basic levels of income. That again, today we have things like minimum wage that try to protect the lowest amount that people can make. They did not have those protections at this time, and one of those things that they're fighting for that, frankly, we have them to thank for, things like minimum wage. Now, the government would step in, and they would do different things to try and not only meet those demands, but in this case, you can see the 8-hour workday. Today we still have kind of this as the standard. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for recreation. We also see the established precedent that the president would break up strikes to allow this interstate trade, and again, that would continue on in the 1980s. Excuse me. The air traffic controllers in this country went on strike, and they were federal workers. They went on strike demanding higher wages, and President Reagan basically denied that and said, you better get back to work. They refused, and he actually fired every single one of them. So the president, and labor unions have often not gone well together, depending on who it is. And what we see, especially after some of these violent actions in the late 1800s, early 1900s, is that union activity would actually decline for a little bit. Like I said, it'll peak later on, but it would decline for a little bit. People got kind of tired of the violence that was associated with it. But once some of the basic needs were met, we saw the importance of them kind of decline. But again, that would ebb and flow over the next few decades. We would see a return to labor unions later on. All right, so for our final section, we're going to be talking about some individual reformers, and we're going to begin with journalists. Okay? At the time, they took on the nickname muckraker, and sometimes you'll still hear this thrown around today. Journalists who wrote to a mass audience, so they often had nationwide or even international audiences, but they wrote about corruption, the corruption that they saw, in the workplace. The woman pictured here is Ida M. Tarbell, and she wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil Company. When Ms. Tarbell was 14 years old, her father was a hardworking man in Cleveland, Ohio. He had his own oil business. They were not extremely wealthy, but he was an independent oil owner. And a young man in his 20s came through who was starting to make a wave in the oil business. His name was John D. Rockefeller. Now, as we know from earlier in our last unit, John D. Rockefeller would go on to become the wealthiest American of all time, and basically creating a monopoly in the oil industry. Now, we mentioned how that oil company, Standard Oil, would be broken up later on, and you have this woman to blame for that. So, Ida M. Tarbell never forgave Rockefeller coming in and basically forcing her father to basically sell out. Rockefeller basically went into their house and said, you either sell me your company or I will crush you. And he had already done some backroom deals with the railroad companies and already had a much bigger share of oil than Mr. Tarbell ever did. And, he had no choice. He did have to sell the company because he knew he would basically go bankrupt. And Ida M. Tarbell never forgave Rockefeller for that. And so later on, as an adult, she became a journalist who decided to expose not only that incident, but the fact that Rockefeller had done this hundreds of other times across the entire country. Had basically bullied people into selling their businesses because he was the bigger organization. He was the bigger company. And, they used some very shady practices. It's not as if, he just said, we're bigger, we're going to beat you. It was, there were sometimes even physical threats that Rockefeller would use to get people to sell. So, the question I asked, robber baron, captain of industry, it's easy to kind of go back and forth. Rockefeller was one that there were a lot of shady business practices that were done, a lot of backroom dealings that, he sought to not only capture a bigger share of the industry, not just through, good business practices, but really, in some cases, actually committing sabotage, actually destroying buildings of competition. And so, this is one of the major problems of the age. Ida M. Tarbell writes this book, The History of Standard Oil, and it brings, frankly, the public's eye to Rockefeller. And in it, she makes some claims that she backs up with evidence, internal documents, even interviewing the presidents or the higher-ups in Standard Oil, where some of them actually admit to some of these wrongdoings. And the public, pressures Congress to do something about it, and they break up Standard Oil. Anyways, people do make a difference. Here was a woman who, she even said she wasn't a very good writer, but, she knew that America needed to find out about the evil things that Rockefeller had done, and it helped, I would like to say bring him down. It broke up his company. He remained the wealthiest man in the world, and in fact would continue to increase his value after that. Now, usually in advanced American history, you guys will read this book, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed a lot of the nastiness in Chicago's meatpacking industry. When people read this, it shocked them. I mean, it truly shocked them. And there are some very, very nasty parts. Now, Upton Sinclair was a socialist. We talked about how socialism was a, increasingly, appealing economic system for some. And his goal in The Jungle was to try and get people to understand, how impoverished, and in particular immigrants, were coming to this country, and how the system really kind of excluded them and kept them, really took advantage of them in a lot of ways. In fact, there's a famous quote by Upton Sinclair where, he says that with this book, he was aiming for the public's heart, but he hit their stomach instead. And the public really didn't react too much to the impoverished nature of its characters. What the public reacted to was the real life scenarios that Sinclair wrote about, in which these meatpacking industries, disregarded really all safety concerns. There would be rats and mice that would fall into the meat grinder, and they would keep going. Sometimes even, limbs. There'd be industrial accidents that happened, and people's arms, fall off into the meat grinder. They just kept going. And people were literally getting sick and dying, but there was no laws to keep the companies accountable. Sinclair changed that. And in fact, they ended up passing a law that we still utilize today. Back in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and that would be signed into law by Teddy Roosevelt, which said that there would be federal inspections of things like meat and pharmaceuticals. And that's why when you pop a Tylenol, that little pill's not going to kill you, because there has been regulation in place that says this has met certain safety standards, protocols, that what's actually in it, the main ingredients. So that's one of the very positive things that came out of this era, that allows for society to frankly function better, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Let's talk about some of the political reformers, the presidential reformers. One of my favorite presidents, he was quite the character, the 26th president of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. And we're going to talk a lot about Roosevelt, not just here, but also in our next unit when we talk about imperialism. He will be a major figure in that unit as well. Teddy Roosevelt ran on what was called the Square Deal. Okay, he said, "I'm not here to favor either business or the people more than the other." And frankly, he knew it was a balancing act, and he ran on the platform in which he promised fair treatment to both. Okay, he knew he was a businessman. He understood that business needed to be conducted, but at the same time, the people have to be protected, and there's a balancing act. And I think that's extremely fair way to look at it. But eventually, Teddy would begin busting up trust. In fact, he becomes known as the trust buster. So busting up monopolies, trying to eliminate monopolies throughout the country. One act that gets passed under Roosevelt's tenure is called the Hepburn Act. And the Hepburn Act did help regulate railroads to basically set rates. This was one of the things we talked about the progressives wanting early on when they pushed out that progressive platform in 1912. This was one of those things that they wanted, going back to even the Omaha platform of that early progressive movement. The Hepburn Act does kind of fulfill that. So the railroads aren't completely nationalized by the government. They don't completely take them over, but they do begin to regulate them, saying, here's how much you can charge. You cannot charge exorbitant rates to farmers who are getting killed by your fees. This is the most you can charge, and regulating some part of that. Now, one thing Teddy is known for is his role in the conservation movement. Teddy was an avid hunter, and he loved the outdoors. And one thing he started recognizing, excuse me, was that especially out west, a lot of our beautiful land was being gobbled up by mining companies, by companies that were destroying the land. And he was instrumental in getting land preserved, conserve it for future generations. He would help establish some of our first national parks, 100 million acres of land, government land that would remain under control of the government for the people to utilize and enjoy and visit. 51 different wildlife reservations preserved under his order. So, I hand it to Teddy. This is one of the greatest things I think any president has done to preserve this land for future generations. And, as someone who loves to travel out to places like Colorado, I tell you, I'm so thankful that previous generations made that sacrifice. There was tremendous pressure on men like Roosevelt to change that. I mean, they could have made a lot of money for both themselves and for the government by selling off this land, but instead they did what was best for the people. Not every politician does that, so I applaud Teddy in that manner. Now, the man who followed Teddy, and we'll get to this in our next unit, it was really a strange scenario. In 1901, the president, William McKinley, will be shot and killed, and Roosevelt was his vice president. He takes over in 1901 and serves out the remainder of that term. 1904 is the end of that term. Well, Teddy ends up running again in 1904 and gets elected. Okay, so he served basically 2 terms, kind of 2 full terms, but he was only elected once. Now, at the time, there was nothing that said Teddy couldn't run again, and people urged him to run again. Dude, you're so popular, keep going. But he didn't want to break precedent that George Washington had set, 2 terms. No one had served more than 8 years. He didn't want to be the one to do that, and he said, it's my turn to step aside. Now, he basically did handpick his successor, which was this man, William Howard Taft. Taft would run away with the election. Again, with Roosevelt's support, he was very, very successful. Sadly for Taft, one of the things he is remembered for the most is his physical appearance. He was a very large man. He was 6 foot tall, about 2 inches shorter than myself, but quite a bit larger. He was 350 pounds, and I'm sad to report that, yes, there is a common story about Taft that is true, in which, because of his, largeness, he actually did get stuck in the White House bathtub at some point. I hate that here I am 100 years later. I'm sorry, Taft. I had to tell the story. But anyways, Taft did a lot of good things. In 4 years, and he would only serve 1 term. I'll get to that here in a second. In 4 years, he would bust up 44 trusts. 44 different companies that were labeled as monopolies that were stopping competition. They were becoming very wealthy because they were limiting competition. Not a very American sentiment. Taft would bust up those, which was, I'm sorry, I said 44. 90. He would bust up 90, which was twice as much as what Roosevelt did in twice the amount of time. So, in a lot of ways, Taft was the trust buster instead of Roosevelt, but he's hardly remembered for that. More for the, bathtub. Anyways, 1912, he will also help establish what's known as the Children's Bureau. This would be what helps investigate child labor to make sure that child labor is not being utilized. And I think the next slide we have, I can't remember, but I think we might have already covered it. There were laws that began to be passed in each state saying that child labor should not be used, and the Children's Bureau kind of goes even further in helping that diminish child labor. And today, we really don't have an issue with it in our country. Child labor is still being utilized throughout the world, and that is a major problem that needs to end ASAP. Now, 1912, Taft runs again. There were a lot of Republicans that were, frankly, kind of angry at Taft that they did not like kind of the direction he had gone. And so many of them urged Teddy Roosevelt to run again. And again, he had the legal opportunity to do that. So in 1912, you have a strange situation where you actually have three major candidates. And Roosevelt will run again as a progressive candidate. Now, he will become the main leader of what is the Progressive Party that, in fact, I think you have an assignment this week due to me where you will look at the platform of the Progressive Party in 1912 and you will actually create a campaign poster for Teddy Roosevelt and issuing some of the things that they supported. Now, some people questioned Roosevelt and said, you're getting kind of old, are you sure you're going to be able to do another term if you win this thing? And he said, I feel as strong as a bull moose, right? Now, bull moose is this big hulking figure, this huge moose. I feel as strong as a bull moose, and everybody loved that. Teddy Roosevelt is the manliest of mans, and so they nicknamed the Progressive Party the Bull Moose Party. So 1912, you have this strange situation to where you have Taft, the current president, running against a more popular previous president, Teddy Roosevelt. But then you have the Democratic nominee, okay, the third guy, Woodrow Wilson. Without Roosevelt running again, I think Taft probably wins the election. But the Republicans split their ticket, and it paved the way for the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson, to take over. Wilson is a very debatable figure. Wilson will be president. He will have a lot of progressive, policies that he does push out. We're 2 years away from the First World War, from the Great War, and just a horrible time in human history. Wilson will be president throughout that war, and frankly emerges as the hero of that war. And he's seen as kind of the savior in Europe, when America shows up and kind of turns the tide against Germany. Wilson had a lot of faults as well, and frankly, I think I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that he definitely with today's standards, you can absolutely say that he was a racist. He did not support civil rights, and that's very problematic. When we talk about someone like Wilson, and needs to be criticized as such. So we'll take a look at some of those policies later on. We do have a whole unit on civil rights, and we'll talk a little bit about civil rights, just as we did in this unit, throughout most of our units. But we'll share some of that conversation later down the road. Today, though, I do want to talk about some of the progressive stances that he had that kind of fit into what we're talking about today. He ran on a platform called the New Freedom, and he had also attacked trusts, believed that trusts needed to be broken up for the best interests of the American people, but also would attack tariffs and high finance. So it's kind of weird to think that multiple parties could kind of run on this progressive idea, but that's kind of the wave that's going on here. People were getting tired of monopolies and seeing the power that they were having in crushing normal businesses. Under Wilson, we're going to have the Clayton Antitrust Act. And what this did was it took the previous law that had actually been used to break up things like Standard Oil, and it is going to go even further than the Sherman Antitrust Act that had been passed, I believe, in the 1860s. This said that corporations couldn't own stock in other corporations. And so, that was one of the big things that Rockefeller had used in trusts to control other corporations without really even owning them. It's also under Wilson that we have the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which investigates unfair business tactics. We'll see the FTC still remains in power today, and still investigating. Today they're investigating things like Google. Okay, companies like Google that do they have too much of the market share in which they are able to manipulate other companies and basically force them out. Using kind of unfair business practices. So the FTC is still around today and still a very important agency. Now, it's also under Wilson that we have a major shift in how the government is financed. Up until this point, we have had tariffs, and we talked about tariffs in a previous lecture, a tax on imports. That is how America made its money all the way from George Washington up to this point. But in 1913, that will change. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is passed, and this establishes the federal income tax. So we reduce tariffs as the national income. Taxes are lowered there, but it does create a new tax on one's income. Now, at the time, it was quite low, and it was not seen as too controversial because it was such a low tax. That tax has risen quite a bit. Okay, and today, you know, if you are in the top tax bracket, I mean, we're talking about 30-40% of income being taken. So, and that is, no one likes taxes. No one likes taxes. But this is kind of the beginning of that, and it's a major shift, like I said, away from tariffs, which we really haven't utilized too much since. Again, we talked about the Trump tariffs that started in 2016. And so there has been some changes there. But we also have the creation of what's known as the Federal Reserve. And there's always a lot of questions about the Federal Reserve. It is actually not even a government agency. It looks very official. It has a name federal. But it's actually a collection of major banks that kind of the head banks that the government works with in order to make sure that there's the proper amount of money being supplied. So, the Fed is what sets interest rates, and because of that, you have interest rates, higher, lower, and that really affects the economy. So the economy is a lot of it is based off decisions made at the Fed, and again, that forms under Wilson here in the early 19-teens. Guys, I think that'll do it. That is our last slide. There it is. Oh, there's the end of it. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this unit and learned a little bit about the progressives along the way. As we wrap this up, I want to remind you I'm always available via email. Please get to me if you have any questions. But there should be a review guide coming out soon. And good luck preparing yourself for the exam. And I look forward to seeing you guys for the next unit.